Hi everyone, I'm Bonnie Nozari from Carnegie Mellon University, and today I'm going to talk about the nature of segmental representations in handwriting and typing. And specifically, I'm going to ask the question if such representations are position independent or not. This question is important for the problem of sequencing. If you want to produce a word, it's not just sufficient to know what segments go into that word, you have to know in which order do those segments go into that word. This is not that difficult for words that don't have any repetitions in them, but as soon as you get to any repeated segments, now you have a problem. For example, take the word people. If I say what comes after P, you have to know which P I'm talking about. And this is why models like simple chaining are not sufficient to solve the problem of sequencing. Two solutions have been proposed for this problem, one of which is context-sensitive encoding. So the classic example of this are Wickel-Grant features. And the idea there is that there is no such thing as a standalone representation of P. Instead, P is always represented along with the context right before and right after it. And that's how the two P's in a word like people are distinguished from one another. This does solve the problem, but it's computationally pretty expensive because you have to have so many different representations in order to be able to represent all the words in lexicon, because segments can appear in the context of many different segments. A more computationally efficient solution are frame theories. These theories hold that a word has two sets of representations, the content, which are the segments, and a frame in which the segments go and sit. For example, for a word like people, you have a frame like that, and you can insert the segments into that frame. The nature of the frame I'm not going to get into in the talk today. It could be ordinal position, it could be positions from the frame, that's the idea behind competitive queuing models, or it could be more linguistically sophisticated frames such as a syllabic frame. But the idea is that the two P's in people are now distinguished from one another by the link that they have to the different slots in the frame. So this is great, it's computationally efficient, but the question is still open of what's the reality of segments in production? Are they position dependent or position independent? I'm going to try to answer this question today for handwriting and typing, harnessing segmental similarity and its consequences in the production system. Similarity has been really useful for psycholinguists to learn about the cognitive architecture of the language production system. Based mostly on the findings on speech errors and the similarity between the error and the target, we now know that if people want to name something like cat, this is more or less what happens in their production system. Semantic features of cat get activated, they activate the word cat along with other words that share some of those semantic features. So that's how you get a semantic error like dog. Activation further spreads in the system, activates phonology, later on articulatory phonetic features. But there is another feature in this system that gives rise to segmental errors, and that's feedback from the lower layers to the higher layers. I'm just going to show this to you in a small part of the system, not to overcrowd the slide. So take phonemes a and ta. When they get activated, they send activation back to a word that shares those phonemes, such as mat, and mat itself then activates its segments. And so that's how you get a speech error that's related to the target in its segments, in its form, even though it doesn't have semantic features in common with it. Traditionally, we know that semantic competitors, when they get activated in the system, they interfere with the production of the target. So looking at this model, you expect the exact same thing to be true for words that overlap in segments with a target. However, traditionally in psycholinguistics, this has not been the common belief about segmental overlap. In fact, if you have people repeatedly name pictures of items that share an onset like cat, cup, key, what you end up getting is facilitation compared to the same items being named in the context of segmentally non-overlapping items. So this might look like something really different is going on with segmental overlap than semantic overlap, but over the past 4 or 5 years, we have produced a series of papers showing that the onset facilitation is a strategic effect. And in fact, if you get exactly the same idea, but now make blocks of items in which segmental overlap is unpredictably distributed. For example, you have pictures of cat, mat, cot, cap, map, mop. What you end up getting is interference, as opposed to naming the same pictures in the context of words that do not have segmental overlap with them. This is true for both spoken naming and for written naming. And even if you just subset a part of the block with segmental overlap in onsets, you get exactly the same pattern of interference. So there is nothing inherently different from onset overlap. You just get onset facilitation if you put people in a situation where the next onset becomes really predictable and then record RTs because they know exactly what's coming up. However, the effect of segmental overlap, just like the effect of semantic overlap, is primarily that of interference. So now we could use this effect to probe the nature of segmental representations further. Specifically, what we're going to do, let me move my picture so we can see better, is test two kinds of models against one another. In the first scenario, we assume that the representations are position specific. So take a representation like P. In top and cup, it's always a P coda, so it's the same representation. However, that representation might be different from a P that appears in the onset position in a word like pen. So if representations are really position specific, then there should be no interference from word pen to the word top. However, if the system is set up such that all words that share P at some level connect to a position independent representation of P, then we could expect interference between pen and top, just like we would between cup and top. We're going to look at this using stimuli that are set up in this way. We always pair a target word, such as link, with a word that overlap in its segments with a target in the same position. So that's a word like sync. And we add a position, we add a condition in which we take the same word in the overlap condition, make an anagram of it. So now we have a word that shares the exact same segments with the target as the overlap condition, but now none of them are in the same position. And so we're basically asking the question, does skin interfere with the production of link just like sync does with the production of link? In experiment 1, we're going to look at this in handwriting. I'm going to explain the general setup of the experiment and then go into how we obtain the dependent measures. The paradigm is called the word pair paradigm. We've used this in a couple of papers successfully. It's a simple and really useful paradigm for looking at the effects of similarity. Participants at the beginning of each block, they see two pictures. So that's the pair that they're going to produce in that block. And they see their labels, they get practice with them. And then on the next 16 experimental trials, on each trial, they see one of the two pictures in randomized order, and they are told to produce the name as quickly and as accurately as they can. 42 subjects participated in experiment 1, and we looked at this in written picture naming. So to do this, we use a tablet with high precision. It can record RTs and durations. I'm sorry that I'm not showing you an actual picture of the experiment. I meant to do that, but with COVID, we cannot access the lab. So this is a picture from the internet, but it's pretty close to our setup. In the actual experiment, on the upper half of the screen, they see the experimental picture, and in the lower half of the screen, there is a box, and they write in it. The experiment had 3 conditions. It's always the target word paired with a second picture that overlaps both in segments and the syllabic structure, link sync. The second condition is an anagram condition. The target picture is paired with a word that shares the same number of segments, different syllabic structure. link skin. And we also included a baseline condition in which the target word is paired with a word that shares neither segment nor syllabic structure with it. Error rates are pretty low in handwriting, so that's not something to worry about. What I'm going to show you are measures of RTs and durations, and it's important to obtain both of these measures because they could trade off. Participants could start writing earlier and then take a little bit longer, or start writing later and then shorten the duration. So it's important to always look at both of these things. We always analyze the data with two methods. This is, in this case, we did multi-level modeling and permutation tests, and the results I'm presenting to you are those in which the results of the two methods converge. So the first thing to see is that both for RTs and for durations, the anagram condition is significantly longer than the baseline condition. So even though the position is not the same, the word interferes. For RTs, in this experiment, we see numerically longer times for overlap compared to the baseline, but this did not reach statistical significance. We do see the effect in durations, but we were a little surprised that we didn't replicate this effect. This made me think that the problem might be because participants could put their pen on the pad and register an RT before they're completely ready to write the word. Even though we tell them not to do that, they don't always listen. So to replicate the anagram finding and also to resolve this discrepancy that we have between this experiment and our previous experiment, we replicated the experiment in typing. So in typing, we don't have the same problem because unless they know what key to press, they cannot register an RT. We used the effect from experiment 1 to estimate the necessary sample size for experiment 2. That's how that's determined. The structure of the experiment is exactly the same. They're just typing their response in a high precision keyboard. Here's the results of experiment 2. They are identical to that I showed you in experiment 1. We replicate the effect of anagram being much longer in RTs and in durations than the baseline. And we now replicate our own previous findings that the overlap condition is both longer than the baseline and has a longer duration. Let me put the results next to each other so you could compare. As you can see, experiment 1, experiment 2, they're identical. In all 4 comparisons, anagram shows interference. In 3 out of 4, we replicate the finding that overlap also shows interference. And only in 1 measure, we also get anagram being significantly longer than the overlap condition. But although this is the only place where it reaches significance, you can see that the pattern is pretty consistent. So we always seem to have a little bit more interference in the anagram compared to the overlap condition. And so this is something that seems to need explaining. What I think is going on here is that in the overlap condition, there are 2 opposing effects. On the one hand, you have segmental overlap, which creates interference. On the other hand, you have the repetition of the same syllabic structure, which induces priming, because across trials, you don't have to keep switching between different syllabic frames. And so that's why I think it's a little less of an interference that comes out because it's been countered by facilitation. If this is true, then the effect should show up, the effect of interference should show up earlier in the anagram condition because there is no facilitation from the syllabic frame, and a little later in the overlap condition. We could look at this by looking at the IKIs, or inner key stroke intervals. So in a word like link, IKI 1, 2, 3 are the times between the first and the second and the third, and the third and the fourth letter. This is what you see here. And as you can see in the IKIs, the first IKI shows the strongest interference effect, and in fact, the only statistically significant effect between the anagram and the baseline, and it's only on the second IKI that you see the effect of overlap. So this goes with the prediction that in the overlap condition, you have some facilitation in the beginning, which is only countered by interference later on. And we think that facilitation comes from the retrieval of the same syllabic structure. I'm going to wrap up by presenting conclusions. What you have here is segmental overlap that causes interference in word production. We already knew that, but the new thing that this experiment added was that an interference is seen regardless of whether the overlap is in the same or a different position. So this means that position independent segments really do exist, at least in writing and in typing. So that's closer to this model that we have over here. A third experiment was planned for this to test the same effect in spoken production, because we have reasons to believe that spoken production might behave differently. Unfortunately, because of COVID, we could not collect those data, but keep an eye out for that. I want to thank my students who collected this data, and my collaborator, Brenda Rapp, who collaborated in the collection of the first set of data for segmental interference. Thank you so much.